Hi everybody. The purpose of this video here will be to give you guys a chance to, for those of you that either weren't there or would like an extra review, to go back over the kind of why are we here, digger deep aspect of Hinduism, which we're going to talk about over a day and a half or so throughout the class. So as I said, for those of you that either had to do this asynchronously for whatever reason or just want a review or something like that, this video will help you out. Now, the first thing we did, if you remember, was we talked about the Rig Veda and the importance of fire and Agni, the god of fire, and what is meant by, like, fire and sacrifice. And we talked how important fire was to the early things, that we're dealing with primitive societies in which, like, they believed that they had to chant the Vedas in order to make the sun come up the next day, and that, fire was really important because fire went up, and, like, you would often find, like, things where sacrifices were given to the gods in which things were burned because then it would disappear and go up, or in which, like, fire was just, like, a center part of a ritual because of that, and stuff along those lines. And so we talked about things along those lines the other day in our discussion in class that's on Canvas, that you can find fairly easy. Anyway, and so this is just kind of a review of those, like, prompts right there. Now, in talked about the importance of fire by showing people pictures of my wedding, and explaining, how often it is that, like, because that's my wife there on the left, and yes, I was married in an Indian wedding in Chicago, in which we were told that, like, they could get the ceremony down to 20 minutes, and they got it down to an hour. That's still better than, like, the normal 3-hour to multi-day Indian wedding, for those of you that know what I'm talking about. But quite often during the wedding, and that's where you see this, and during a number of different things, you have to use fire. You have to, like, give an offering to the fire or stuff like that. And during the course of it, my father-in-law, who's sitting over there on the left, managed to actually light the mandap, the big tent, on fire, because, like, he's a little bit absent-minded, and he put the fire back in the thing, and it didn't happen there, and it was windy in Chicago, and it fell off, and so, like, the bottom of the flame started smoldering and stuff like that. And I'm kicking my little brother, who's my best man, who's next to me, being like, put the goddamn fire out before anybody notices, and the whole wedding burns down. But it didn't. So hence the uses of fire in various ceremonies. We'll look at it further when we talk more about puja as like the ritual and how we actually get there as we go along through Hinduism. Now, what I do want to give you on the next 3 slides is literally, like, the kind of, like, information in the lecture part, and it won't be super long because a lot of it involves pictures, and it's stuff that we'll also talk about. And so there'll be other, like, questions or things like that on Canvas if you miss class to also take a look at to continue going here. But what this is if we talk about the why are we here aspect of IB, what we usually get to is, like, what's the creation story here, right? And that's what this story gives us right here. Okay. Now, there are bazillion creation stories. Okay. Tons of different ones that come after the Vedas, and, like, some of them are very clear and are tales of the gods, which is what we're going to look at now. These are known as the Puranas. Like, if we were in class, I would pull out this huge, like, couple thousand plus page, like, thing called a Puranic encyclopedia that I had to find, like, shipped from India in English in order to be able to use it, that gives you, like, all the various different internal diverse stories of the gods, and we could look through that and stuff along those lines. And we've talked some about Ganesha, and we'll talk some about Durga a little bit later, and I'll tell you some kind of god stories as we go along, right? And so what happens is, as the religion progresses, is some of the old Vedic forces are replaced by more, like, anthropomorphic gods, and you actually get, like, a number of, like, hardcore creation myths, not just, like, things came together. Okay, here is one out of about a bazillion. Okay, I just happen to like this one. I think it's mildly funny. I don't think it makes a ton of sense, which is part of the reason it's mildly interesting, and it also gets you thinking. But it also does do a good job of explaining the part that comes out of that, and the caste system and stuff like that. Now, the other thing I'd say with this too is, much like we talked about with the story about Ganesha and stuff along those lines, like, there is, like, Brahma creates the world, how he does it, the diversity, etc., that's always there. But almost always he creates the world. You have Manu, the first human. You have, like, children emanating from him of good and bad desires of humanity, etc. Like, it's not going to be 100% consistent, but some of these things are going to be fairly consistent from story to story. So this story has Brahman, desiring to create something out of the universe. So he removes the darkness from the universe, and he planted water and a seed. And out of the seed grew into an egg. Okay? Just run with me. Don't ask me why he created water and planted a seed and then that had to grow into an egg, but just run with it. Out of the egg came Brahma, the creator god. Okay, so Brahman did this, and now he's going to back up. He's the overarching being, remember? And now Brahma, the creator god, is the one who's here. Now, Brahma at this point, like, creates all other worlds. Okay, there are about 40 different ones, 28 hells. Big ones are Earth, the world of the gods, the world of ancestors, etc., etc. To do this, he continues with the egg that he split out of. He came out of it, but he didn't split it. That's important, right? This is kind of like, who is it? Athena popping out of Zeus's head. Like, she doesn't, like, just gets a headache and then she pops right out, but his head stays intact. Same types of thing. And so he lets the egg sit through a year, and through concentrated thought, he splits it in two, creating heaven and earth, adding water and salt around the earth and separating it from other worlds. Not knowing the way the earth worked, but knowing that there was water and stuff like that, the ancient belief was that you had the earth, and then you had the water surrounding India and stuff along those lines, and the mountains up top, and then you had a huge ring of salt that people couldn't get around, and after that you got to the gods, etc., etc. This is the ancient belief, not the modern belief, of course, people. And so he separated through concentrated thought. By the way, this led to one of my all-time dorkiest comments in the history of IB World Religions, where some kid, who I will not reveal him, though he probably deserves it, but I will not do this to him, raised his hand and was like, Doran, this is the same story as the creation story in the, I believe he said Alola region of Pokemon, and I just kind of put my head down in shame. But one of the reasons I'm saying that, and one of the points to make, is you will find not only in Western, but also a lot in, like, some of your, like, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, like, pop culture things that have made it over to the West, that there are, like, elements of, like, religion or various terms or various ideas or people or stuff like that will pop up all the time. And so I always just like to use that as the first example. Okay, so now he has, through concentrated thought, separated the worlds, created heaven and earth, etc., etc. He then creates Manu, the first human, Manu, okay? Manu has 24 children, and these are the good and bad desires of humanity, okay? And these come in the forms of gods, devas, asuras, etc., etc. These are all just various, like, heavenly beings that can make things up, okay? Manu's kids are less important than, like, the end result of what happens with Manu here, okay? Because this is how the religion next gets founded. Okay, from Manu would spring the rest of humanity. Okay, and the story is that early on in humanity, everything was perfect. People did their duty. There was no problem. I mean, almost like a communist utopia to a certain extent. They lived. I'll have you read a part of it at one point, but, like, they lived with the gods, and then after that, they lived in these trees, and they were, like, very large, and they ate these splendidly gorgeous meals, and eventually, like, humanity downgraded, etc., etc. And so one of the key things to come out of this was the idea of the caste system, okay? And it was created as a way of helping keep up the interconnectedness in the Dharma, helping make sure that everybody does their duty and helping make sure that everybody performs their role in life, right? And so it was created from the ideas of Manu. So, like, if you take the one human being Manu down at the bottom, ignore the pyramid for a second up top, but if you take the one human being Manu down at the bottom, you've got Brahmins, who are the ones that pray, they come from the mouth, etc., etc. Kshatriyas, the ones that fight, they come from the arms. Vaishyas, the traders, etc., etc. Merchants, the thighs, and then Sudras, the skilled laborers, come from the feet. Okay, and you can see that in a pyramid system right here. We should note, and this is really, really, really important, okay, the man, okay, the unadulterated pyramid, like, not this pyramid system, but the man, right? Manu, and then it also being a part of the man, all being important for the man to be able to, like, function and understand. In other words, you need arms, you need legs, you need a mouth, etc., etc., right? That was the original envisioning of this, okay? When Western imperialists came into India, they purposely set it up in a hierarchical caste system so that the Indians would fight amongst themselves, not be able to rebel as easily, like, have internal, like, dissent, etc., etc. They pushed that caste system. They tried to set the castes against each other, and that's how we get to, like, the social thing of there being issues with caste and stuff like that in India. They also created this outcast, or this untouchables caste, which had really never been there before, isolating, like, people even further, if that makes sense. So the original purpose of the caste system, though, is to make sure that everybody has a role, and then according to Hinduism, your job is to do that dharma, or that role. That is your sole job in life. As I said earlier, as Krishna says to Arjuna, better to die than to fight the role of another. So the whole story, as we'll talk about in the Bhagavad Gita, is you've got this guy Arjuna, who's a Kshatriya, and his job to fight, and he's fighting his cousins, and he doesn't want to fight his cousins, and the gods look at him and say, too bad, fight your cousins, that's your job. Okay? Like, and that's the way this was set up, was not necessarily in a hierarchy sense, but in that everybody has a role. Now, that still does make movement different. That still does lead to a kind of caste or class system. Sorry, that's the better word for it. A kind of class system, etc., etc. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm just saying it got changed very different from how it was intended, right? So after you have the creation of like the first world and stuff like that, you start to get a like more formalized like god system or system of like deities, if that makes sense. And remember, as I said, like, modern Hinduism would argue that these are just versions of the same god, right? As one Hindu priest was in my class who put it one time, he's like, look, if somebody steals your iPhone, you don't go to the president, right? You go to, like, the local police, because that's their job. And like, God is this overarching, massive, large being that's involved in everything. And so like, we comprehend it in different ways, and we don't need to go to the main thing. We've got, like, he's got other parts of him or her or it or whatever you want to call it that still work on those things, that still do various things like that. You just comprehend them in different ways because it's so massively large you couldn't comprehend it itself. Okay. And so what happens in history is that the Caucasus people in the Caucasus and then in North India come down what is known as the Aryan Society, and they conquer the people that were there, known as the Dravidian Society. And there are a lot of social issues that come up with that as well. But yes, that's exactly who, like Hitler and the Nazis were trying to go all the way back to, was like the Aryan Society of that. As a matter of fact, if you go to India today, you'll find swastikas, which are a symbol of peace, all over India, or good luck. Like, I mean, I remember like the first time my wife came back or first time I was actually in my in-laws' place, and I was looking at the bag, and I was like, why is there a swastika on the bag? And they were like, those are all over India. That's a common symbol, stuff like that. Yes, that's how ridiculous the Nazis were being. Anyway, back to this. Aryan society is going to replace Dravidian society. And what happens with that is these old Vedic gods that were based more on like fire or water or air are somewhat replaced by more anthropomorphic gods. They still play a role, but not as large of a role. Okay. And you get three major gods. Okay. This is one of those things that comes up all throughout all religions, the number three and the idea of three things, etc., etc. And there was and like, it is so ubiquitous, it's almost impossible. And here's our first example of it. Of course, those of you that are Christian would know the most common one, just because of the way Christianity has become the largest religion, is the Trinity. But it happens actually in all sorts of religions all over the place. This is known as the Trimurti, and what you have is Brahma, the creator god, Vishnu, the sustainer god, and Shiva, the destroyer and remaker. So, like, for example, these are the three biggest gods, at least in their importance historically and stuff like that. Brahma will create the world. Vishnu comes around. Vishnu will sustain it. He makes sure that everything's okay. From time to time, Vishnu has avatars or incarnations. These avatars or incarnations will come down to Earth. The most popular of which is Krishna and Ram, or Rama, both of which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Others, I think there's actually one that's like a huge snake at one point. Like, the Buddha is supposedly one of them. Like, etc., etc. And so he kind of protects over and sustains the world now. And then the final one is Lord Shiva, who will destroy the world. And when I say destroyer, kids generally think of that as bad. It's seen to be the world's gotten to be evil, and Shiva's the destroyer of evil and remaker of the world. So he's actually considered like a good guy as well. Though, to be honest, most Hindus will either be more towards Vishnu or more towards Shiva. They tend to kind of lean one way or the other as the two big things. Brahma actually is not worshipped because Brahma lost a cosmic bet to Shiva where he lied about things, and so the end result was he was cursed and he wasn't worshipped, stuff along those lines. There are tons of other gods, and they fall in and out of popularity like crazy, right? The most popular one, as I said earlier in the thing, is definitely Lord Ganesha, the elephant-headed god. But other ones include Kali, they include Durga, who's absolutely fantastic because Durga is this incredibly kick-ass female god, who's like, it's one of those things where like no man can slay something, so the gods put together a woman who is like, awesome, and Durga represents like all the power that is like, that women can and have and stuff like that. So you've got Durga, you got Saraswati, the god of education. You've got Hanuman, the monkey god, who actually can like, make himself as light as a feather and weigh as much as a mountain and move everything. So Hanuman's pretty awesome too. I mean, all these guys that are in and out of popularity based on region, based on location, based on time, etc., etc. As I said, though, modern Hindus will tell you that this is not polytheism. These are just manifestations of one large god, possibly Brahman, possibly whatever you want to call it, who's impossible for humans to actually comprehend. Here are some pictures right here, and I've read you some stories about the gods, and I'll continue reading more, and you guys are going to do a little bit of research on them now. On the left, you can see the Trimurti. You've got Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva right there. with their various like symbols. These guys all have various like symbols. They have numbers that are important to them. With Shiva, for example, you have the trident and stuff like that. With Vishnu, you've got the peacock. You can see the feather in his hat, right? Down on the bottom, you've got Ganesha or Ganesh. By the way, I think I mentioned this in class, but I haven't said it on the actual thing. But the reason that you've got the A on these and sometimes on it and sometimes not is that in Hindi, the A at the end of the word makes a word masculine like that. Whereas that's not true in a lot of your Western languages. So originally the move was to drop the A to try to make it sound more masculine, but like that is not in vogue because that's not like, that's kind of like stealing culture and stuff like that, and not actually listening to it and stuff like that, etc., etc. So now people have tried to bring back stuff like Ganesha instead of Ganesh, or Rama instead of Ram, or you know, stuff along those lines. The unfortunate thing is, I learned religion at a time when people dropped the A, so I've tried to put the A back on everything, but originally I learned it as Ganesh rather than Ganesha, so sometimes I think of it that way. Or like, Ram rather than Rama, or stuff along those lines. Either is fine. Put the A on the end of it, don't put the A on the end of it, not a problem whatsoever. But anyway, you can see Ganesha down there. You can see his mouse that's his best friend and his ride, and the glob jamun he likes to eat, and stuff along those lines, his broken tusk from where he wrote the Mahabharata. On the right, you have Durga, the one that I said was the amalgamation of all the gods, and this really kick-ass woman who's like, can absolutely beat. She's supposed to be like the most badass warrior ever. And up there top, you have Kali, who's actually an incarnation of, depending on your point of view, either Shiva and or Parvati, which is usually Parvati, which is Shiva's wife. And she goes on this like completely murderous rampage at one point, like, able to like destroy all evil in her path and stuff along those lines too. And there's kind of a weird cult to her. If you've ever seen the Temple of Doom, that's kind of based, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, that part's based on the cult to Kali there. Um, these are actually pictures taken from a temple in South India that like give you ideas of some of the ways that these deities are used. The actual physical deity is important, like the idol, as it would be. Like you dress it up, you put food in front of it, you do a puja or prayer in front of it, as it talked about in the thing. Don't worry, most of the food won't be gone, but that's because the gods are light eaters. They just come down and take what they need really quickly. Not even enough for you to be able to notice, and then they go back and then the rest of the food's donated and stuff along those lines. But you can see like they are active like elements of worship, not just kind of passive elements of worship. And it's not just the god itself. It's also sometimes like as I said, Nandi, Shiva's ride, stuff along those lines gets dressed up in place of Shiva if there's not a good like thing there. Um, This is a popular temple that I just thought was interesting to Vishnu and a number of his avatars. It's in South India, and it actually involves like walking about 10 and climbing 4,000 stairs to show devotion. Quite often you'll see temples are shaped like this, and then they have like various carvings of the gods on the side or stuff like that. Often when you run into Vishnu, you'll also run into Hanuman right here, because Hanuman was very, very close with one of Vishnu's avatars, Rama, and helped save him and helped win the Ramayana and the battle that led to Diwali, the battle and then the return to Ayodhya, which led to Diwali and stuff along those lines. So like those will often come together, and so this is just other kind of real world examples of that. Or just this is a picture that I took in a temple of a dancing Shiva, which is like Shiva doing the dance that he will do to like destroy and remake kind of the end of the world. So you see the idols kind of used all over the place in various temples and stuff like that. And the thing that's also important to keep in mind about Hinduism is that Hinduism, as we said, is Hinduism is one of these religions, unlike, say, your Western religions, that it's perfectly, perfectly, perfectly acceptable to be a great Hindu and like almost never step foot in a temple. Most of these rituals can be done sometimes with a priest who you bring in. They're not necessarily COVID. Sometimes without a priest. Stuff like that, but most of these rituals can be done just kind of in the home. So this is an example of an in-home puja. This is performed by women in home for wealth. I have some kids that'll come in and they're like, Doran, I know exactly what you're talking about. My parents keep all the gods like in a kitchen cabinet, and like all of a sudden they'll realize like it's Ganesh Chaturthi, which is Ganesha's birthday, and they'll like pull out Ganesh and we'll have to do like a nice puja to Ganesh and stuff along those lines. And so like that's exactly like same type of like, I mean that's what it would be like, a situation like this in the house, like that. I'll talk to you more about like some examples of that when we get further on into pujas or stuff like that. The last thing I want to talk about, and you can ignore some of the stuff at the bottom. That stuff we're going to talk about in class, much like I had discussion questions at the very beginning. These will be the discussion questions we kind of talk about in class afterwards and stuff. But the last thing I wanted to talk about is the like theory of the degradation of the world. Okay. Um, because this is important to understand. The ideas that I said earlier is that the world dies and remakes itself either every 4.1 or 8.2 billion years. The text says a day in the life of Brahma, okay? And what it's unclear on is whether that means a day, meaning like just the 12-hour day or the 24-hour day and night. And if 4.1 is a day, does that mean it then becomes 8.2 and blah, blah, blah. So that's debatable. But you've got these really, really long, like, um, epics, right? Okay, and they're divided into things called yugas. And the idea is that, like, originally the first stage is called the Golden Age. And, like, everything is perfect and everybody does their duty and the cow walks on 4 feet. I was bringing this up when I was talking about, like, the caste system and stuff along these lines. And then after some people make mistakes, then the Dharma degrades after, and they're not equal. They're this kind of, like, weird mathematical spiral that like makes them half of the previous self or something like that. So the first one's like 2 billion and the next one's like 1 billion and the next one's like 5, and my math's not right, but you guys get the idea of what I'm talking about here, right? And then the Age of Trey, where like there's still some gods here. The Ramayana still occur. That's when the Ramayana occurs. That's like one of the better ages of the world, etc. Like people know to do their duty. You don't need the caste system. But once you degrade to the Age of Deuce, then like the Age of Deuce is this age right before ours, and the earth becomes corrupt, and people institute the caste system in order to make sure that like people do their duty and follow that and stuff along those lines. And this would be when the Mahabharata takes place, at the very end of that. And then the story goes that at the very end of the Age of Deuce, when the Mahabharata takes place, this is that great battle I've been talking about with Krishna, with Arjuna, and teaching people, hey, you need to do your duty and stuff along those lines. There's a lot more to it than that. Those are just the most popular characters that I bring up right here. Anyway, when that story takes place, at the very end of it is something known as Janmashtami, which is the day, and again I'm butchering words like crazy, which is the day that Krishna disappears from the earth, and this is the beginning of the era we're in now, which is the Kali Yuga, and this is the last Yuga, and this is when the Dharma has degraded itself, and people are generally not good, and religion has started to disappear, and they don't know to do their life, their world, etc., etc. And the idea is that we're about 4,000, 5,000 years into the Kali Yuga right now, and we've still got several thousand left, and at the very, very end of the Kali Yuga, Vishnu will return briefly as a kind of messianic figure in his final avatar, Kalki, and then once he has helped save the rest of the Atman, gotten them back, etc., etc., Shiva will come, do the dance of death, destroy and remake the world, and then we'll start the whole thing again, like I did explaining the story about 20 minutes ago, with Brahman breaking up and creating Brahma, and then Brahma creating the world and starting again. As I said, we could be on the first iteration of this according to Hinduism. We could be on the 85th iteration of this according to Hinduism. We could be on the 9,314th iteration of this according to Hinduism. We have absolutely no idea whatsoever. So hopefully this gives you an overarching idea of why are we here. I'm going to take, we're going to do some stuff in class with this. We're going to look at deities and stuff like that. And then we'll get back in talking about like, either what is the human condition or how do we get there with kind of like video lectures and stuff like that, either on Zoom or me doing it this way in the future. So I'll see you guys in a bit. Later.